Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I hope, well, good morning, depending on where you are. Good evening. Let's just go with a good day, shall we? I don't know where in the world you are. Um, Here in London, it is the weather is not the best. It's trying to storm. So if you lose me due to the weather, I apologise and we'll try this again, but we'll see how it goes. So you'll see me looking down. I've made notes because obviously this is only my second time doing this. This is going to be completely me talking to you, no demonstrations this time. So I've got talking notes beneath where you can see, so I will be looking down at them from time to time. I published this week's blog yesterday, which was all about what I consider the most important records for British genealogy, which are basically your births, marriages, and deaths records and census records. And by census records, I'm talking about the 1841 to 1911 census, but also the 1939 register, which kind of acts as a census substitute, particularly because we don't have a 1931 census because it was destroyed in the Second World War, and no 1941 census was taken. So even though you may be aware there's a 100-year rule, so we don't have the 1921 census yet, that's coming next year, we will never have those because they don't exist. So the 1939 register is the only record that we have kind of spanning that period. So once the 1921 census is released, we won't see another one until 1951. Sorry, 2051 even. 1951 will be the next one that we see. Which, yeah, if they stick to the 100-year rule, wouldn't be released until 1920. Wow, Rach, numbers are not my strength. 2051 or 2052, which, for some of us may be out of our lifetimes. So, yeah. Anyway, so let's get down to it. So the reason I wanted to do a blog post on this specifically is because they're really important for British genealogy. They're really important if you just want to do straight genealogy, but they're also really important for your DNA matches, even if you're not British yourself. If you're white and American or Australian, you are likely to have some English DNA matches, and they might be quite close DNA matches, and you might want to try and work out how you're related, and they may not have very extensive trees, and you might need to work quite far back. So if you want to do that, you're going to need to know a little bit about British genealogy and which records you should be looking in. So by looking in these records, you can basically develop a family tree generally to the mid kind of 1800s, a little bit further back if there are parish records available kind of online. And that's for most people, unless you're, I don't know, for example, if you've got a lot of Welsh ancestry and you've got really, really common names in your tree, then it can be hard because you don't know which John Smith is your John Smith, or, it can be difficult in those circumstances, but it's still useful to know. So that's why I covered them in the blog article. So today I wanted to give you a couple of extra tips for research and how to use those records to build or extend your family tree or someone else's family tree. So my number one tip is that you should work backwards from what you know already. So for example, you may not be aware of your great grandparents' names, but most people that know their birth family at least would know what their, say, grandmother's name was. And you'd have a rough idea of when she was born and whereabouts she was born. And if you don't know, there's probably somebody that you can ask that might have an idea of that information. It might be, though, that you know your grandparents' names, but you've got no idea of what your grandmother's maiden name was. So if you ordered, say we're talking about your maternal grandmother, so your mother's mother, ordering your mum's birth certificate would give you that information because it will have your mother's name along with her maiden name. And that can actually help you if you need to find their marriage record to get your great grandparents' names, or at least the father's names if we're talking about an English or Welsh ancestor. That can help you find the marriage record even if you don't know any other information. Admittedly, if your grandmother was, say, Nancy Smith and your grandfather was John Jones, you're going to struggle to find the correct Jones and Smith marriage somewhere. But generally speaking, it's really good information to have. So that's why it's helpful to work backwards. And it might be that, say, so you found your grandmother's birth record, or you found your mother's birth record, you found your grandparents' marriage record. You can go a bit further back, but maybe grandma was not born until the 1920s. So grandma is not going to be, she'll be on the 1939 register, but you're not going to be able to see her because she's not in that over 100 years ago record. So then that's when it's going to be really helpful to know what her parents were called, because then you can look up those names in the 1939 register. And by this time you may have a sense from the birth certificate where in the world, or where in the country to look, and hopefully you can find them. And generally there's occupations as well, or an occupation would be given for a father on a birth certificate, and that information would also be carried forward onto the 1939 register as well. So that can help actually if you're talking about a common name and you've got more than one in the same area. If there's occupations listed, if an occupation matches what you've got on a birth certificate, that can help you be sure you've got the right record. And then of course the 1939 register has birth dates, which is also very helpful if you then want to go and find their birth records, and so on. Now, I've completely lost track of my notes, so let me just refer back. I've probably jumped a little bit ahead. Oh, no, we're not doing too bad. So yes, so that's kind of the process we work with. So you're kind of looking to go one step back all the time. So we've got people on the 1939 register. Great, that can lead us to births, marriages, kind of in that intervening period. And then you're back to the 1911 census, and suddenly you've got maybe their parents. You can see who was in the household at that time. You might even have an elderly parent living with that family on a census. So suddenly you get another generation back as well. You've got more to research. And another reason why it's helpful to look up to really pay attention to who is in a household on a census is the fact that if you are dealing with a really common name like a John Smith, they may have a sibling that's got a slightly more outlandish or slightly more interesting or unusual name that there's not as many of on the birth records. So then what you can do is, instead of trying to find your John Smith, you can look up this other name in the birth records, try and find that birth record. Then you can see a mother's maiden name, and then hopefully you can work out which of the many John Smiths born in a specific time period in a specific area is yours, because you've got a maiden name to work with to find the right record. So that's one thing I recommend. I've talked about, creative marriage index searches. So where you literally have no idea of people's names, but you've been able to work out what's, say, your great grandmother's, what her married name was, and then you find out her mother's maiden name, but you've no idea of her parents' names. You can use that principle of searching for marriages by just searching on surnames. And if you've worked one out from the census, perhaps based on somebody's relative age, or you're just going to guess on the relative age of your great grandmother when people might have been married, you can literally just plug into, I think this works on Ancestry and Find My Past. I know for a fact it may work on others as well. Those are the two principal ones I use. But yes, you can literally just put in two surnames. You can leave it at that, just leave the search at that. Don't even put any years in if you don't want to. Don't even put any locations in. If it's really unusual names, it's probably going to work. Otherwise, it's generally better if you can put in some kind of location, some kind of time period. And I will say here, actually Find My Past is better for this particular search because Ancestry limits you to a plus or minus 10 years at a specific event. Also, if you're searching for marriages that took place before 1916, the spouse search isn't available at the moment, at least, so you kind of have to do it longhand, searching through the records. But so Find My Past, you can do this exact search. I've done it many times. It works perfectly. And I don't know why, but their search for marriages seems to just work a little bit better. And you can do things like if you know a particular great grandparent married somebody with a specific first name. So let's pretend we've got our John Smith again. So let's say you know John Smith married Harriet. There's lots of John Smiths, but you can do a search on Find My Past to just show you what marriages were between somebody called John Smith with marrying somebody with the first name of Harriet. And then again, if you want to, you can add a specific location, and the location search there is great because you can put in a specific location and then you kind of do it in miles away from this specific location. So you can be really narrow it down if you want to. So I could say Frodsham in Cheshire is where one of my ancestors was from. And I could say, okay, I want to look at marriages for this. We're going to talk about him a bit later, actually. So, name of Thomas King. And I want to see all the marriages for Thomas King that took place within anywhere from 5 miles of Frodsham, Cheshire, right up to 100 miles. So you can go that specific, or if you're really not sure, you can just say a county. You can say Durham plus 100 miles of Durham, or whatever you want to do. And their year search is a lot better as well, because although Ancestry limits you to plus minus 10 years, Find My Past you can do plus minus 40 years, which is if you really don't have a clue of when somebody got married. That is really useful, because otherwise with Ancestry you're kind of having to try one thing, then change the parameters a little bit, try the search again. So I'd use both, kind of not necessarily interchangeable. It depends what exactly I need to search. Sorry, that was a bit rambly. Hopefully you got the gist. What else is on my records here, or my notes here? So census records. So using census records again can help you find earlier births. So you might not have a clue as you get back in generations. You may not have a good idea of when to search for a birth, which again, when you're having to put in a year parameter on either Ancestry or Find My Past, it's really helpful to be able to narrow it down a bit. Now, as you're looking at census records, you will probably notice that if you manage to track somebody through all the censuses that they're alive for, you'll probably notice that ages, that people seem to have been creative with the age. And I'm not even going to say it's especially females, because it's not, it's men as well. Men and women just seem to like to make themselves a bit younger as time went on. I generally find the younger somebody is on the census, so the earlier the census in relation to that person's age, does tend to be more accurate, unless you can't use this rule for the 1841 census, because the 1841 census, the enumerator was actually supposed to round up or down. I think was it just up? I can't remember. But they were supposed to round it to 5, the nearest 5-year period. Not all of them followed the instructions, so you will find exact ages given, and thank you those enumerators who didn't read the rules properly. But generally speaking, only a rough age is given on 1841. But for all the other censuses, you can use that as an idea to work out when you should be looking for a birth record. And the other thing that censuses are particularly useful for is kind of giving you a good idea of, I guess, kind of the economic circumstances of your ancestors at any time. Um, Admittedly, the 1911 census is fantastic for this because it's got the extra information of the kind of the childhood mortality information. It is known that poorer families and families in kind of slums, I guess, in slum locations, there's a really high childhood mortality rate, and that is reflected on census records. You can see, sometimes it's heartbreaking. Sometimes you see like a woman who's given birth to like 12 or 13 children, and yeah, only one or two have survived, which is, I have seen that. It's horrible. But then I've also seen it where, and even in poor locations, that's not always the case. I have seen situations where somebody's had 8 children and all 8 have survived. Great. Um, yeah. And the other thing the 1911 census has is the kind of the dwelling size, so the size of the property where a family lived. So obviously, if you've got 8 people in a household, but they're living in 2 rooms, their economic circumstances are not great. If you've got a family of 4 or 5 living in a much bigger house, that tells you something as well. And obviously, on all the other censuses and 1911, the occupation of somebody gives you a very good idea. If they've got maids or if they've got any other kind of servants, that gives you a good idea that they're going to be more well off than others perhaps in your family tree. So yeah, your aim is to basically find your ancestors on each census that they would have been alive for. Now, you're not always going to be able to do this for whatever reason. Some people are missing from censuses. Sometimes the census records for certain areas don't survive. Some people seem to have escaped being on the census, including one of my ancestors, and that's very frustrating because I can't trace them, and I have no DNA matches on that line as well. And I found the address, so I've seen the address. I know what address they should have been at. I know they were there because I've got them on birth and marriage records, kind of either side of a specific census year. And I can't remember the exact wording on the census that has the address on it, but it says something like, unoccupied, no one here. Yes, there was. Somebody was there. They were hiding. I don't know why. I'd love to know why. I digress. That's not on my notes. So censuses also can give you a time frame for a death. So if somebody is on census records and then they're suddenly not, but all the other family is there, that's a good indication that maybe that person is not there anymore. Obviously, if it's a child, then the child, if they would have reached kind of anywhere between, I guess, 13 to 20, they could have gone off to work. So you could be looking for them on other censuses to try and find somebody of that name in that area, perhaps working as a servant or something like that. Obviously, if it's a husband or wife that's suddenly not there anymore, then in theory, it should say widow or widower against the surviving spouse. But not always. I have seen somebody listed as a wife when the husband was no longer there. We don't know why. And I have seen somebody described as a widow when the spouse was very much alive and kicking, but they were shacked up with somebody else. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. They just were. And sometimes they're in prison or something like that, and we're pretending they no longer exist. Who knows? I never know in that situation if it's the householder that's given that information or the enumerator has assumed it or been told it by another neighbour. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about as to what I consider kind of the usefulness of those records and how I use them. So finally, I just wanted to talk about or an example from my own tree as to why it's really useful and really important to, if you can afford to get records yourself, to check them and to actually order them and check them properly. And this specific example, it predates the General Register Office having its wonderful online search facility. So actually, if I were doing this research now, I still would want to order the certificate, but I could understand that something wasn't right just by looking up that search in the register. Now I'd be able to see that. So let me tell you what the example is. So one of my ancestors was Thomas King. Thomas King was born in 1842. He lived, I think he was born in Frodsham in Cheshire. He lived most of his life in Aylesmere Port, which are very close to each other. One may have even gone into the other. I can't really remember the history of that. It has something to do with the Port Sunlight factory, I want to say. If my dad's watching this, he's totally going to correct me. So anyway, so Thomas King, I'd managed to get to him. I knew of his existence. My dad knew of his existence. I actually got into family history kind of as a teenager, and I knew certain branches of my tree before I ever did research myself. And Thomas King was one of them, because Thomas King is actually named on my grandfather's marriage certificate as his father. Which we knew wasn't true because we knew he was the father of my grandfather's mother. But I didn't know any further back than Thomas King. I knew Thomas King was he's my 3 times great. So actually, I've missed a generation out somewhere. Oh yes, I remember. You don't need to know that bit. He's an ancestor of mine, but yeah, 3 times great grandfather. Now, so when I was researching him, I was probably like most people. I was looking at other public family trees. So that would have been Ancestry public family trees, and I think back then it was probably Genes Reunited or something like that as well. And I think I'd searched for him on Family Search, and he wasn't on Family Search at that point. But there were 3 or 4 Ancestry public family trees that listed him. There was enough information for me to be 100% certain that this was the same Thomas King. There were no others in the area. As I say, Frodsham in Cheshire, it's a very specific area. There were other Thomas Kings, but completely different age. And the occupations were quite different as well. So I knew which was my Thomas King, and I knew this person the other trees were showing me was the same person. The thing was, so all these Ancestry public trees listed his parents as also Thomas King, so Thomas King Senior, and his wife Mary Paling or Paling. And I thought, okay, great, that looks all seems legit, great, fantastic. I then managed to find a baptism record for my Thomas, and that also listed his parents as Thomas and Mary. So, but yeah, this is definitely it. As I say, if I was doing this search now and trying to order a birth certificate for him now, and he was born in 1842, so this is only 5 years after birth records started. So thankfully he was born when birth records were there. And if I were doing that search now, I'd immediately see that there is no Thomas King born in that area in 1842 with a mother whose maiden name is Paling. I would see that. And that would obviously raise some questions. But I didn't know that at the time because there was no online source that showed mothers' maiden names for records of that age. So I ordered the record. I knew it was going to be the right one. And when it arrived, it said that his mother was Mary Abram. And I knew that I was expecting it to say Mary Paling or Paling. And I thought, well, what's gone on here then? And I actually did look at some of because he had a lot of brothers and sisters. So I looked up some of the births for some of the younger brothers and sisters, and I did see that there were several births registered to kings that had a mother with a maiden name of Paling. And it turns out that Thomas King Sr., his father, married two Marys, simple as that. The first Mary died. In fact, she died in 1843, so only when my Thomas was just a year old. So, yeah. And so Thomas Sr. married for a second time, and it just so happened that his second wife was also called Mary. And so what had happened is that obviously people on Ancestry had assumed that it was the same mother of all the children when it wasn't. And I was able to find a death record for poor old Mary Abrams. And she died, I think, of consumption, if I remember rightly. So, as I said, just when Thomas was about a year old. And I'd have to go back and look at the records. But if I remember correctly, Thomas actually married Mary Paling a couple of years later. But Mary Paling had previously been married to his brother, who had also died. So he actually married his brother's widow, probably to ensure that there was a mother to take care of these very young children, because there were several children, very slightly older than Thomas as well. I think they would have all have been kind of under 10 when Mary Abrams died, and that also did confuse me a little bit for a little while, because I then realised that some of the children who were on later censuses weren't Thomas King Sr.'s at all, they were his brother's children. So that all got a bit confusing as well. And then they later had children together as well. So that's just an example to show you how Ancestry public trees can, even if they look like they're really well researched and it looks like it makes sense, it does pay to check into the records yourself and just make sure that you're 100% clear on everything. So that's kind of all I wanted to cover. I've managed to keep it under 45 minutes, so better than last time. I will see you again next week. I think next week, I don't have my schedule with me, but I think next week's blog article is going to be, I think, on Ancestry DNA, kind of overview of Ancestry DNA. So the tutorial or the Facebook Live next week will be somehow something to do with that subject. So let me know if you've got any questions that you definitely want me to try and get to, either in the blog article or like this. I have actually previously done this article a couple of years ago when I first started the website, but about a week after I published that article, Ancestry updated everything. So my article was very quickly out of date. I mean, it's still useful, but a lot of functionality has changed. And since then, it's changed multiple times. And there's definitely things that make DNA research much, much easier than it used to be on Ancestry. So I hope you found this interesting, and I hope you'll find that interesting. And I will see you next week. All right, bye-bye.